Welcome everyone, and today we'll have our second research seminar, I think, this term. And again, these research seminars and this research seminar is part of the Center for Material Thinking, which is mainly situated in the TFTS, but it's also co-run and co-hosted quite often with the art school. Today we have the pleasure of having a talk by Liesbeth Groot Nibblelink, and the title of the paper is "Where Scenography Meets Ecology: Assemblage, Affect, and Material Thinking." So before the talk, I'm just going to briefly introduce you, Liesbeth, if that's okay. I'm just going to read out the biography. Liesbeth Groot Nibblelink is an assistant professor in the Theatre and Performance Studies at the Media and Culture Studies Department of Utrecht University. Her research interests include dramaturgy and scenography, spatial theory, performance ecology, and new materialism and performance philosophy. She is the author of Nomadic Theatre, Mobilizing Theory and Practice on the European Stage, and has contributed, among others, to volumes such as Rancia and Performance, Thinking Through Theatre and Performance, and Intermedial Performance and Politics in the Public Sphere. At Utrecht University, she coordinates the master program in contemporary theatre, dance, and dramaturgy. She also teaches in the RMA Media, Art and Performance and the BA Media and Culture Studies programs of the department. And in 2013, she co-founded Platform Scenography, an open source platform for scenographers and dramaturgs that seeks to stimulate reflection on scenography. She's also active as a dramaturg and artistic advisor. Okay, and that's it.
Thanks, Piotr, for the introduction, and thanks to you, to the University of Liesbeth, for inviting me into this series, and also thank you all for coming. It's very nice to see these names. Also, for the first time for me, sometimes see names to see faces to names, the names that I know, but the faces not yet. So this is really wonderful, and also makes me long a little bit for that this should have been a live event. But of course, at the same time, it's very wonderful that the fact that we are now so, we got involved. I'm not saying that we got used to doing stuff online, but we got so involved so much that we can have this exchange. The talk for today is taking scenography as a point of departure, and I would like to share with you some observations, intuitions, and thoughts that all circle around the idea of affect, assemblage, and material thinking. Because I think that these are terms that do not stem from the discourse of scenography, but can be very helpful in articulating what scenography is, and all these thoughts are really closely connected to my involvement in platform scenography, where I collaborate with scenographers, and we often talk about what is actually the scenographic quality, or what is actually meant when people look at designs or are in rehearsal spaces or designs in progress. And we talk about whether things work or not. So what is this working then? It's a kind of intuition, and we feel very much the need to expand scenographic vocabulary. So I'm going to share my screen and show you some slides meanwhile, and I will sometimes get back to the non-slide situation at the same time. And yeah, let me start this slide. Yeah, let me see. Yeah, so today I'm going to present some thoughts and ideas that all have to do with this thinking in progress, and I would like to to mention that explicitly. That's a kind of thinking in progress, a kind of building an assemblage of ideas that all circle around scenography. And I will relate this work to the work of Benjamin Verdonck, who is a Flemish theatre maker. And I thought, before I really go into those concepts, let me introduce Benjamin Verdonck to you, because he's probably not that well known abroad. So he's a Flemish theatre maker, an artist, a bricoleur, you could say. He loves to collect things. His work is very varied in the sense that he makes performances, sometimes interventions in public space, sometimes projects that have the length of a performance, but also one-year projects that consist of smaller projects. And very often he combines a kind of playfulness, a very large, big sensitivity for materiality, and a political questioning of things. And to introduce him by one work, this is a nest that he created on the wall of the Permeke building in Antwerp, which is a library. And he put up one also in Ghent, which is another large, big city. This was in 2015, but he has fondness of nests. These do appear in his work regularly. So the pictures on the right that you see, they are from work in Rotterdam in the Netherlands in 2009. And in the picture below, if you look very closely, you can see also Benjamin Verdonck himself sitting in that nest. So his theme is also like building huts and houses and other stuff. And well, and if you to explain my movements, meanwhile, I have a young cat walking around my laptop. I hope things will work out, but if something weird happens, it's the cat. So back to Benjamin Verdonck and these nests. They are the nests in Antwerp and Ghent were built in 2015, prior to the climate conference in Paris. And actually he wanted to raise attention and mobilize people to think about climate. He often publishes books around his projects, and he also, this one was documented. I made a picture. The text is in Dutch, so I'll make a brief translation of this. So on the top of the page, it says urgency, art, and goesting. Goesting means to be in the mood for something. And then below that, there's two divisions. On the left, unity. Yes, I will go to the climate march in Paris. Yes, I will be coming. No, I won't be coming. And on the right, there's a list of possible observations that people could have looking at the nest. And I'll make a translation of things that are written down there. So what people could have been thinking, what is this? I never saw such a big nest. Did the bird get lost? Is the bird ill? Why is no one cleaning the building? Is this a joke? Is this an ornament? I like it. I don't like it. What do you think of it? Is there no place for the bird anymore in the woods? Do I agree that there are things hanging in my city that I find dirty? Who put up the nest there? Is this art? Did the artist ask for permission? Did nature get disoriented? Or are the people so disoriented that they make such strange things? If I were a bird, where would I put up my nest? And you? Is a bird allowed to do anything? So questions that, to me also expose quite an open mind to how you could question things and mobilize things in a playful way. So this as a first introduction to Benjamin Verdonck. I will be introducing some other projects along the way. And first we'll be talking about affect, then continue to assemblage and to material thinking and related to his work. I don't know if I already said this, but this assemblage is this idea of this open-ended network, and I will be putting in some building blocks, so to say, but I very much hope that we can continue the assemblage in the second part in the Q&A. Okay, so affect and the relationship with scenography. I already briefly mentioned that when it comes to scenography, there's often this idea that things work or not. And it is something that I keep returning to lots of times when trying to articulate what scenographic qualities are. As you probably all know, scenography is much more than designing a set or a background for action. The scenographic act is one of great sensitivity to spaces, materials, behavior, both of humans and more than human organisms. It relates to temporality, it relies on relationality. And scenography, I think the scenographic working is very much about effect, actually. And on top of that, scenographers have a great sense of scale. And this has nothing to do with their skills of making scale models, but what I mean is that they, I think, are wonderful in taking something ordinary and relatively small as a starting point to large-scale reflection. They can take, for instance, a table, analyze the materials, and from there on derive all kinds of choice-making processes, like, is this a cheap table or not? Is it an object for showing off? Does it have an average size so that it is compatible to a container and as such a product of the global market economy? Or is it a rather invisible table, or is it a mediator or a connector? And all of these qualities have to do with affect. Now, what do I mean when I say affect? It sometimes gets mixed up with emotion or personal feeling. This is now not how I tend to use it. I'm much more inclined to use the word in line with the Deleuzian Guattarian thinking, which who have a much more non-psychological approach to sense, sensitivity, and sense making. They, for instance, speak of blocks of sensations that can traverse through a body. Affects are intensities. They are flows of desire that temporarily hold a space or a body or any other space. And I strongly rely on a remark that can be found in the work of both Brian Massumi, philosopher, but also Kathleen Stewart, a cultural anthropologist, that affect has a lot to do with the capacity to affect and to be affected. And of course, it's a bit weird to define a word with the word itself, but I will give you some quotes in a moment, and hopefully in building up, this increasingly makes sense. I like this sentence because it's simple and complex at the same time. It means that there is an openness to something else, to something that affects us, that renders itself present, however subtle. It is about attentiveness, about eye for detail, about subsurface view, about scenography. Scenographies are masters in observation, and it's about seeing and knowing how things are made and used and experienced, or could be used otherwise. And in all this, in thinking of affect, I got greatly inspired by Kathleen Stewart's book, Ordinary Affects. In this book, she presents short stories of everyday life. I already said she's a cultural anthropologist. But she has so much eye for detail, and the way she writes, that's really demonstrating this capacity to be affected. And I think that her work is a very convincing interpretation of what thick description could mean. And she herself described her work as a cultural poesis. And in an article in the Sage Handbook of Qualitative Research, she describes this as a method in which she looks at it as describing of emergent assemblages who are made up of a wild mix of things: technologies, sensibilities, flows of power and money, daydreams, institutions, ways of experiencing time and space, battles, dramas, bodily states, and innumerable practices of everyday life. And this becomes a generative, producing wide-ranging impacts, effects, and forms of knowledge with a life of their own. And this is what I call cultural poiesis. So it's something in the making. I think that all the things that she describes are also great examples of what affect can entail. And it's not only that things are generative in themselves, her cultural poiesis is also about how one writes about it and how one is impacted by that as well. Another quote from this article, which is more on the writing, and the writing here is one that tries to mimic felt impacts and half-known effects as if the writing were itself a form of life. It follows leads, sidesteps, and delays, and it piles things up, creating layers on layers in an effort to drag things into view, to follow trajectories in motion, and to scope out the shape and shadows and traces of assemblages that solidify and grow entrenched, and then dissipate, morph, rot, or give way to something new. So in her working with ordinary affects and her response to that, already the idea of an assemblage emerges, and actually also very ecological thinking in the latter quote, I would say. And when I read her writings, I always have the feeling that she could be a scenographer, or this is the way her sensitivity very much corresponds to what I recognize as scenographic. So to become a bit more concrete, I'll give two examples from this book, Ordinary Affects. One is a story in which she describes how a cafe next to a road gets stirred because two people enter who seem kind of shocked or shaken, wearing biker's clothes. And immediately the atmosphere in the bar changes from cozy and casual to, hey, what happened to these people? It's a very subtle change, but I think we can all imagine such change in atmosphere. We all have this capacity to be affected. As an example of this sensitivity in writing, she describes the scene as follows, quote, "The room came to a dead stop as all ears tuned in to the sentience of the crash, still resonating in the bikers' bodies," unquote. So how a crash can resonate in a biker's body, also very much an example of affect. So it turned out that these people got into a collision with a deer, the bikes got splattered, the deer disappeared, the people in the cafe come and help these people. So the story is a bit longer, but hopefully this gives an impression. The second example is a short story that I will quote in a moment. Lots of these stories are quite short, half a page or even less. Some are a bit longer, and they are collected in the book. They're not related to one another, but of course they do resonate with one another. So that's why I find it helpful to briefly indicate what comes before this story that I will read out in a moment. So the previous story is a reflection on the Turner Diaries, which is a fascist novel and which causes bizarre links between, and I quote, between racist rage, disorder, contamination and decay, and an appreciation for the well-tended suburban lawn, the Martha Stewart-inspired interest in interior design, and the fantasy game of reading catalogs to imagine oneself in that dress with that face holding that particular gun. So it conjures up an image of situations in America with gun-loving people who and the idea that you can sometimes even buy smaller examples at Walmart stores. And then the next story, it goes like this. The self is no match for all of this. It's a dreamy, hovering, not quite yet there thing. A fabulation that enfolds the intensities it finds itself in. It fashions itself out of the movements and situations that are surprising, compelled by something new or buried in layers of habit. It can become hyper-responsive, touchy, volatile, and tuned in, or it can grow dull with anxiety. It gets caught up in the quick, repetitive cycles of ups and downs, the flights of fancy followed by disappointments, satisfactions, rages, or dreams of rest. It exists obliquely in dreams of disappearing, of winning or being done with it all. Forms of attention and attachments keep it moving. The hypervigilance, the denial, the distraction, the sensory games of all sorts. The vaguely felt promise that something is happening, the constant half-searching for an escape route. So no explanations, no context, just this. And I don't know what it is for you, but I can very much relate to this, that this is what we go through in a day, like the moments where you feel, yes, we're going to do it, or maybe not, things that work out or don't work out, your attunement into somebody or a space. So you go through so many of these aspects on a day, I would say. And what is interesting in her way of writing, I think, is that there is perspective, there is focus, there is something, someone that is doing the focusing, the paying attention, but there is not really a subject one identifies with. Instead, one identifies or is able to recognize the sensation itself, the affect. And I think that, yeah, it's kind of my statement here is that this kind of sensitivity is precisely what characterizes the scenographic. Yeah, I've been wondering, like, what is she doing actually, apart from how she describes it herself? And I think some of these elements have to do with the art of paying attention, emergent ethnography, by which I mean this observation that is not so much putting forward a subject, although sometimes she does write in a third-person perspective, but mainly to arrive at descriptions through the events and affects. And response. So she is also. She wrote herself at some point that this kind of writing is also about fashioning some form of address that is adequate to their form, to find something to say about ordinary affects by performing some of the intensity and textures that makes them habitable and animate. So this so far about affect. Now I would like to connect that to, for the first time, to some work by Benjamin Verdonck. And this is a project in 2009 called Calendar. And this was a one-year project that was dedicated to all kinds of rituals that can mark up a human's life. So rituals that sometimes stem from religion, but also personal rituals or group-related. Yeah, and if you want to see more of that, there's a link to the overview page. Maybe I can share this PowerPoint later on. Yeah, and some examples from that project, some are very playful. For instance, the one that you see on the right, it's a Santa Claus running through Antwerp, but on the 23rd of January. So he's a bit lost in time. Yeah, he runs around Antwerp, he's ringing a bell, he's a little bit in haste, but there's no explanation what he's calling for or what the haste occurs, except one can maybe explain it through the idea of getting lost. What it has to do with affect, as far as I'm concerned, and the ordinary, is that normally Christmas and ritual They are related to trees, to gifts, to family dinners, to shop windows dressing up, well, the whole event. But now there's a weird guy dressed up figure who still is able to brighten up the city. And the stirring of actually the intervention in the public space, that's very much related to affect. And one that I found very touching, to refer to the emotional element of affect still, that was the one that was related to the sales days, or solden as it is called in Flanders. And there, Benjamin Verdonck, you see there are men on the left with lots of shopping bags from expensive stores. So he was carrying all these bags, but looking very unhappy, really on the brink of crying. And you see, if you go to the overview page, a series of pictures where he walks through these streets crying. And it also has to do with, it is kind of a subtle commentary, I would say, about usually advertisements talk about how shopping makes you happy, of course, but this one is really about how one gets really unhappy. Some were more political, like a project that he did in May called A Paper Castle for Those Without Papers. And this project was about what in French, and the Flanders is half French, or the Belgium, I should say, the sans-papiers, so asylum seekers, people asking for asylum. And with 20 asylum seekers, he occupied the Bourla City Theatre in Antwerp. And this is really a large mainstream theatre in a rather expensive area of town. And he built a paper castle for those without papers. And you see the scale model on the left, but he did build this paper house. And they used the foyer of the city theatre to cook and to exchange recipes, actually, and to ask attention for this failing migrant policy in Belgium at the time, and asking for speeding up the procedures and also for solidarity, and pointing by choosing this space also to the huge differences between the situation of the people that were now occupying the space. And for instance, you see the Louis Vuitton background of the people who shop there, and the large social inequality that comes up from this contrast. So in this paper castle, you can see there's some lines on top of the castle. For instance, Nokia, connecting people. Well, we know this line, but it's sort of, it looks a little bit like, on the one hand, randomly, like there are other texts that are a little bit more cozy, like my home is where my beer is. That's the on top of that. But this one is, you can also look at it as rather critical, like, okay, can we also connect people, maybe not by buying mobile phones, but really about caring for people. Let me check briefly whether I wanted to add something. Yeah. So also in this project, the ordinary is immanently present. This is about life, about humanity, about sharing food, about the right to a home. And the paper castle is also a proliferating object, you could say. And this is how affects operate. The paper castle is many things. It's how you may have built a castle when you were a child. The idea of a castle poaches the imagination. And on top of the castle, Nokia, connecting people, but now an invitation to take that serious. The castle gets entangled with migration politics, it gets entangled with economics, since it is situated in this economic quarter around the Bourla city theatre, where shop owners were really not amused. So you see here a variation of scales and senses and meanings that are present here, and that are all mobilized through this scenographic intervention. Yes, so, and this brings me to the assemblage, because in this scaling up all these layers of meaning, already the assemblage comes into existence. Again, many people have written about the assemblage. I have some quote from Deleuze and Guattari in mind when they talk about how assemblages are multiplicities, how they cannot increase in number without changing in nature. But I'm especially inspired by Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, and books have come after her, but she, as far as I'm concerned, she has this lively, vivid description of an assemblage where it really becomes clear that, and now I quote, that assemblages are living, throbbing confederations that are able to function despite the persistent presence of energies that govern them from within. They are not centrally governed. They have the ability to make things happen, but what happens is more than the sum of the force of each materiality alone. And that element of more than the sum of each materiality alone will return later on in this lecture and talk as well. And in Vibrant Matter, she talks at some point about agency within assemblages, and she provides this example, you may be acquainted with it, of a power grid that collapses. It's a real-life example from 2003 in the United States and Canada, where the dissonance or the workings and forces between materialities became really collapsed, causing a blackout. And due to all kinds of self-protective mechanisms within the grid, the system was cut off. But she describes this grid, this economic, this power grid, as this volatile mix of coal, sweat, electromagnetic fields, computer programs, electron streams, profit motives, heat, lifestyles, nuclear fuel, plastic, and wood, to name but a few of the actants. And then she goes on a bit more, and she describes how it's also a product of failing maintenance, for instance, and understaffed plants, growing demands by customers. These are effects, but they're also all part of the assemblage. And as I said, I think this is really a very vital image of what assemblage can entail. Well, to connect this also to Benjamin Verdonck, another project. I skipped one. I wanted to connect this as well to once more back to Kathleen Stewart, who also uses the word of emergent assemblages in how one can study these. And she observed them as generative, compositional, immanent to ordinary ways of living and proliferating worlds with disparate phenomena, scales, and compositional modes. Well, you can read the rest of the quote here. But these elements, that they are generative, proliferating, dealing with disparate phenomena and scales, and compositional modes, I think these are all very much present in scenographic thinking. Now, what do I have in mind when thinking of the work of Benjamin Verdonck? There's a project he did in 2016, Friedman's Pencil, and you may know the name of Friedman through Milton Friedman, the economist who used the pencil as the symbol of the free market. And he used it as an example of a global collaboration, like the graphite comes from South Africa, the wood comes from West America, aluminium from China, the paint from India, the eraser from the Netherlands. And this is Benjamin Verdonck quoting Milton Friedman. All these people, driven by the invisible hand called competition, they work together in making this pencil, thanks to which you can buy this at the best possible price, and you contribute to harmony and world peace, because it is about collaboration, according to Friedman. Benjamin Verdonck started a project with school children, lower school, 6 months. He was present at the school, and he asked the pupils to help him to disassemble a pencil, and to deconstruct Friedman's pencil and to bring all of the components back to their places of origin, just as in bringing something to the grave or preparing the way for something new. Here you see some pictures again from his documentation, where he tried to first analyze what kind of materials is this pencil made from, where does it stem from. He suggested also to turn the Eiffel Tower in Paris into a pencil. More on this in a moment. And he wrote a letter to the children asking, motivating his invitation to help him, and explaining Friedman to the children. And from this letter, I take a few elements. Friedman says that person A may earn money in any way he wants. If person B is negatively affected by this, this will be an urge for B to get into competition and to earn more money than person A. Even a beggar can become a millionaire. However, asked Benjamin Verdonck, what if person B, right before he decides to become this millionaire, gets ill and needs treatment, a bowl of soup and a warm bed? So the idea of drawing up a pen, of creating, of making the Eiffel Tower into a pencil is, Benjamin Verdonck gets these responses that is not really realistic, of course, and what does he mean by this? And he writes that with this proposition, I love the small gesture. We have lots of the biggest building, the greatest event, the highest tower, the best hamburger. To stand amidst all that with something as trivial as a pencil exposes how I would like to live, how I would the world like to be. And with the school children in the end, he didn't manage to bring all the materials back to where they came from, but they made a cardboard installation on the playground. And there was a big pencil that you could take apart, after which you had wood and yellow paint, graphite, aluminium, and an eraser. And you could then put those components back into a tree, a pot of paint, a graphite mine, a fire, and a packet of chewing gum. And these latter things were made of cardboard. So a critical, playful yet critical approach to the assemblage or the global assemblage. This is a bridge to material thinking, and I hope that already from the previous examples you can start to see that it is inherent in his way with thinking with the materials. And by using these materials, he arrives at statements or questions, and by putting objects in unusual places, in letting the materials do their work. Think of the precariousness of the paper castle, the triviality of a pencil. Material thinking is a topic that has been on my mind for some time. Also in close relation to that, the idea of material analysis is something that scenographers are busy with. And not only scenographers, but also any kind of designers, actually, makers, visual artists, architects. It's a thinking with materials rather than just operating on materials. And anyone who has been involved in a materially oriented creative process will recognize this, I think. You have an idea, you start making things, and then the material directs you in another way, inspires new solutions, challenges to try out things. So matter has an impact. It changes your working process. It changes your ideas. Lars Spuybroek is an architect who also wrote about those workings, so to say, in an even more radical way than I have now put it. I'm still busy with, let's say, the interaction between the thing, the object, and the human, whereas Spuybroek reflects on how things can work between things, or things and matter. And I think that's, again, his observations are very inspiring and potentially useful to take along when thinking about scenography. So I will present some of the observations in this book and then relate it back to the material thinking that I just presented. So in this book called The Sympathy of Things, Ruskin and the Ecology of Design, he studies how materials work with one another, how they influence one another, and, for instance, collaborate to arrive at a structural integrity. And he has a specific focus on Gothic architecture and the way the 19th century art critic John Ruskin studied Gothic architecture. And interestingly, he connects this to the idea of the digital. So it's not so much a historic study, it's about finding the idea of recognizing the idea of the digital already in the Gothic. And what he means by that is that both in Gothic architecture as well as in computational thinking, these structures or processes rely on the presence of disparate elements that, when brought together, they are more than the sum of their parts. And Gothic cathedrals entirely rely on this effect. So architectural ribs, they are disparate elements, but together they are really creating the force that can build the height of the roof. So it's not that these small ribs are ornaments to a pillar, they all together work to form a pillar. And a very nice example on a smaller scale of this functioning, but I would say also of material thinking, is his comparison of architectural ribs to twigs in a bird's nest. So he writes that the twigs themselves are breakable, but through their interlocking and intertwining, they become acts that together produce an overall stability. And this stability is not a form of rest, but a working, a force. I like that one very much. And then he observes that this nest is obviously an example of design. However, surely we cannot assign these qualities to the bird and proclaim it the designer. There's intelligence in the making of the nest, and there is design, but these occur between things, not behind or above them. And that's exactly why it is computable. I think this is a very telling example of what material intelligence can be. So another word in his title is sympathy. And this is closely related to this working together and creating a force in this collaboration. Sympathy, as we know it, very much relies on psychology. You could say it's captured by human psychology in feeling for someone, for instance. And Spuybroek points out that we can also have feelings for things and objects, and that things themselves can feel towards other things. And in order to grasp this idea, he describes how in the 18th century there was a radically different idea of what sympathy means. So instead of the psychological reading of the term, sympathy then had to do with resonance and with synchronicity. And he provides this example of how a predator moves in synchrony with its victim, how instead, or maybe we should say next to a violent act, it is also an act of providing careful attention to the other, to its moves, the rhythms, and in this case, of course, the weak spots before the attack. This is a moving in sympathy with. We also move in sympathy with things. Spuybroek argues that we can have this sympathy for things, but not so much for images, because there's always an element of time and duration involved. And this for him relates to the idea that things exist elastically, or are elastic, so to say. They are part of a stretch of gradations, as he used to call it. Think of a sugar cube and its potential to dissolve into water, or how a vase implies a table and flowers, even when not in use, or how the vase is also the potential to break. So things therefore exist not only in space, but also in time. And he has some other examples that have to do with feeling for one another. And here's another quote that sort of continues what I was just saying. The fact that one feels the other and that things are present outside themselves are what makes the relationship entangled, not merely spatial. The fringes of the table grow into the glass. That is, the table feels the glass, and the glass feels the table, and the glass longs for the hand to pick it up. But the hand is not there yet. The table longs indeterminately for all kinds of things that are not yet there, but expected. The whole picture is filled with actual elastic feelings. And I think if you look at the table that you are sitting at, or if you have a cup on your table, then look at that cup. There is something in that cup that wants to be picked up, or the table that is welcoming things to be put on. And that is what Spuybroek connects to this feeling with. And one other remark that he makes is that through this feeling with, relationships are entangled, not merely spatial. And also in this book, at some other points, he makes the connection to ecology. He's also someone who relates ecology to networks. But other than, for instance, the actor network by Latour, or he briefly mentions the meshwork of Manuel de Landa, he says that the network also needs feelings to create a sense of interiority, whereas actor-network relations are mostly exterior. And so his work is also about networks, about working together, and that's what for him is the ecology of design. But he adds the importance of felt relations, and then uses obviously feeling not only for people, but also for our involvement with objects and things. So how am I doing with the time, actually?
It's good. It's 20 past.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm moving towards the end of the talk. There's one example that I wanted to show. So one last time connected to a project by Benjamin Verdonck. This is a performance called This Is It. So it's in Dutch, this is it, but it's also this is it. It's the Danglish, so to say, like the Dutch version of interpretation of English. And it's quite hard to say what it is about, actually, because there's a lot of stuff on the stage, and it's mostly about doing things with the stuff, playing around with things. And as a reviewer put it, it's a jerky ride through the logic of feeling. It's a chaotic adventure, an experience that does not necessarily need to be understood. It's not so much constructed according to the rules of dramaturgy, but invented like child's play. Now, I'm going to show you a clip. I hope that it works and that the system doesn't collapse like the power grid. And these are just some pictures of the... oh, no, I already prepared that one. Okay, I think I can... Yeah, I think this works. Does it work? Do you see the pictures? No, you don't?
No.
Okay. Then I think I should maybe, I'll try to do it once more. I should probably select another screen. This one. Do you see it now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what you see is first the preparations for the show, and then the pictures move into the show itself. And I'll just show it and maybe add a few comments, but it's just to get an impression. This is a black crow and a red triangle. And gradually the crow is dissolved by the red triangle. Here is making an alphabet based on just consumery stuff, things, boxes with names. So what you now cannot see is that he has these little acts. So there's all kinds of materials and he's building things, and these are short scenes, so to say, of sometimes a minute, sometimes a bit longer. And then there's a moment of rest, and then he takes some new materials and starts building something else. And this has some elements of a gray elephant. Yeah, okay, we're almost done. Okay, so I'll pause it. I'll stop this one, and for our last time, go back to the PowerPoint. Yeah, I'll skip this one, I think, with an eye to the time. Yeah, I'll close with a few closing remarks. Ecology, I already said it for a few times, is for me very much related to the idea that everything is connected. And I'm thinking of work from Carl Lavery here, who wrote quite a few articles on performance and ecology, and especially in relation to the work of Philippe Ken, a French theatre maker, who is also very much scenographic bent to his work, as far as I'm concerned. And Lavery very animately describes how in that work one gets often very aware of how everything is connected. And this idea of ecology as everything being connected is on the one hand an open door, but it is described in such an animate way that you sometimes start to see that again. Oh, yes, indeed, everything is connected. And Karl Lavery also makes the point that performance, theatre and performance intrinsically are ecological, because how can theatre make its point or make a scene? It's always by collaboration between all these elements: performance, space, time, materiality, light, sound, words. And the same goes for scenography, as far as I'm concerned. That's intrinsically relational. If for instance, in still a relatively conventional set design, somebody makes a set where the furniture is just too large for a character, showing something of the discomfort of this person into that space or in that life, then that meaning or that sense can only arrive through the relation between this person and the size of those of that furniture. So the scenography always arises from relations. Well, in the work of Philip Kennan, there's often these atmospheres or universes in which people and stuff and material are all on a kind of equal footing, just like the theatre is. The various ideas that I presented today, these authors, Spuybroek, Kathleen Stewart, the work of Benjamin Verdonck, I hopefully that they have added up to the idea that there's an intensity of feeling or a sensitivity to material that can help to think about what scenography entails, and also that as soon as one starts to think about affect, one immediately enters a relational sphere, one of everything is connected. As soon as one starts to follow the workings of affect, one arrives at an assemblage, and if one then reconstructs how that assemblage is working or proliferating, one is actually already engaged with material thinking. And as far as I'm concerned, scenography is maybe is not the only one, but excellently suited to bring this awareness to the table, a kind of material thinking that has the potential to make us thoroughly aware of how the knots and strings and lines of our entanglement work, and how and can become that we can become aware of ourselves as entangled beings. So this is it.